All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. This is Left Bank Books welcomes acclaimed author QUAN BARRY, who will discuss one of the most anticipated books of 2022. When I'm Gone, Look for Me in the East. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank our supporters, the supporters of QUAN, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. Left Bank Books offers in-store shopping, curbside pickup, and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for all of your friends at left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and it allows us to continue bringing you such incredible authors like our author this evening. So thank you all so much for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I am the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event, so please type your questions as a comment. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. And now, about our speaker this evening. Born in Saigon and raised in Massachusetts, QUAN BARRY is the author of the novels She Weeps Each Time You're Born and We Write Upon Sticks, which was the winner of the 2020 ALA Alex Award, and 4 books of poetry, including Water Puppets, winner of the AWP Donald Hall Prize for Poetry, and a PEN Open Book finalist. Barry's first play, the Mytilenean Oh no, I will ask how that is pronounced as soon as one is on the screen, which premieres literally tomorrow. She is the Lorraine Hansberry Professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now, about tonight's book. When I'm Gone, Look for Me in the East. From the acclaimed author of We Write Upon Sticks comes a luminous novel that moves across a windswept Mongolia, and estranged twin brothers makes a journey of duty, conflict, and renewed understanding. Tasked with finding the reincarnation of a great lama, a spiritual teacher who may have been born anywhere in the vast Mongolian landscape, the young monk Chunlun sets out with his identical twin Mun, who has rejected the monastic life they once shared. Their relationship will be tested on this journey through their homeland, as each possesses the ability to hear the other's thoughts. Proving once again that she is a writer of immense range and imagination, QUAN BARRY carries us across a terrain as unforgiving as it is beautiful and culturally varied, from the western Altai Mountains to the eerie starkness of the Gobi Desert to the ancient capital of Genghis Khan. As their country stretches before them, questions of faith, along with more earthly matters of love and brotherhood, haunt the twins. Are our lives our own, or do we belong to something larger? When I'm Gone, Look for Me in the East is a stunningly far-flung examination of our individual struggle to retain our convictions and deeper meaning in a fast-changing world, as well as a meditation on accepting what simply is. It is one of the most anticipated books of 2022. It made the list for Time, Bustle, Pop Sugar, Literary Hub, and Essence, and many others as well. Kirkus Reviews in a starred review says, a dreamlike and lyrical journey steeped in the tenets of Tibetan Buddhism. And now, I am so happy and proud to welcome, on behalf of Left Bank Books, our fantastic author this evening, QUAN BARRY.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And I will be talking a little bit about the Midolinian Debate tonight. So it's true that is like the first question people always ask me is, how do you pronounce that? And it's also true, as I'll be discussing, there is an American pronunciation and also a British pronunciation, but I will get to those things soon. So thank you. So tonight I'm actually going to share my screen as I have a PowerPoint presentation. So give me just one moment to do what I need to do here to call that all up.
All right.
Okay, so let me take this big. All right, so hopefully it's all working and you can all see that. So tonight,
everything looks good.
Awesome, thank you so much. So tonight again, I'm going to talk about my new work, When I'm Gone, Look for Me in the East. And then I'm also going to tell you a little bit about my play, The Midolinian Debate, which is currently running here in Madison, in which can actually be streamed starting tomorrow. So I will be talking about those two things. But first, let me tell you a bit about my novel. So as was mentioned in the introduction, When I'm Gone, Look for Me in the East takes place in contemporary Mongolia as we follow a pair of identical twins, Chulun and Mun, as they go in search of a reincarnation. First, I'd like to share with you some fun facts about the country of Mongolia. So it's a country that's roughly the size of Texas, although it only has a population of approximately 3.2 million people. It was also once the epicenter of the world, and this is a slide I'd like to show for that. This is all that remains of Genghis Khan's magnificent city, Karakorum, that was established in the 1300s, and that Genghis Khan's descendants then built into a mighty power. It's true that this is a place where people like Marco Polo once walked, et cetera, et cetera. And so the idea that the only thing that remains from this time period is this stone turtle, I think that's just kind of amazing. Going back to the slide about fun facts about Mongolia, it's a country that has a ratio of one person for every horse. So it's true that the horse culture is very strong there. It's also true that because it's such a big country with so few people, the tradition of hospitality is incredibly important to the culture there. And so if you're in Mongolia and you're out in the countryside, you can theoretically knock on anyone's door and you'll be invited in to spend the night if you choose, to share food and those kinds of things. So again, hospitality is something that is very central to the culture. And then one other thing that's also very central to the culture is that in my estimation, everybody in Mongolia can sing. And so I have just this little clip to show you that folks can really sing. So just to set this clip up, when I was there in Mongolia, I had various college students who acted as my guide. And this was one particular college student who would help set up our tents and those kinds of things. And I would always hear him singing. And then one day I asked if I could record him singing. So yes, they would ask me to sing in return, and oftentimes they wanted me to actually sing the national anthem of the United States. And as you can imagine, that did not go well. So at this point, I'm actually going to read 3 short excerpts from the novel. These are actually just the first 3 opening chapters. We can perhaps talk about it during the Q&A, but the entire book is written in very short chapters. Most of them are about anywhere from 1 to 3 pages in length. And so I'm going to show a bunch of slides that oftentimes correspond to things that I'm reading about. And I'll also talk about them in between the various sections. But this is the opening section of the book. So listen without distraction. Outside the post office in Bor-Urt, a handful of men clump around a pool table, its felt top sun-ravaged and mangy, the men's faces weathered from living in a world without trees. When I step outside, they stare, each man a finger in a fist, and the one slumped in the ratty camping chair at the head of the table is the thumb. I glance at the digital watch the Rinpoche hands me last night, its plastic band already cracked, the thing used. I know it is a necessity, that I must have it for the places I am to journey to in my search that must not fail. Nevertheless, I feel like one of the wild horses foreign researchers shoot down with arrow guns, the animal succumbing so that the researcher can fix the radio collar around its neck, the collar eventually becoming a part of the body. After just a few hours in the July light, the skin around my wrist is already somewhat paler than the rest of me, though, like the planets and the summer sun, nothing is permanent. It is 10 in the morning. The main road through Boer periodically billows with dust as a breeze blows through the town. The men stare at me and then look away. Someone spits in the dirt. Hidden in the folds of my robe, there is a bag filled with more tukruk than they can earn in 6 months or even a year if the winter is harsh. Normally, they would be out on the grasslands, out watching their flocks or herding them in for one of the 2 daily milkings. But today they drive the many kilometers into Boer on their motorbikes to bring their wives in to do the shopping. The men huddle idly around the table as men often do as they wait for women. Men with time on their hands looking to establish their status among their kind. I step out of the post office and their faces fall. I am not what they want. I am a novice of the Yatu Jingol Monastery, a monk who lives in the shadow of the sleeping volcano. As it is mid-morning, the mail truck I am to ride to Ulaanbaatar on the first stage of my journey is not scheduled to arrive for hours. 2,500 years ago, Gautama Buddha says, you only lose that which you cling to. Silently, I approach the table and nod. Brother, booms the one enthroned in the camping chair. He is sitting with his legs spread wide, a toothpick in his fingers as he works at his teeth. Something in the lackadaisical arrangement of his limbs reminds me of Mun. Mun's long black hair often loose like a horse's mane. I only play for money, the man says. A good policy, I say. I lay 2,000 tokruk on the table. 10 minutes later, and I can tell the others do not know who to root for. The one who sits outside the post office each day looking to deprive the local herdsmen of their money, or me, a young monk from Yatugol in his simple red robe. My body wavers like a flame in the summer heat. On the faded table, the balls roll and crack like stars. So that's the first section. And let me go back just to tell you a little bit about some of these photos. So when I was in Mongolia, I actually traveled with a couple that I met there who were Dutch, Hans and Miriam. And it's true that we would go around and that Hans and I actually would play pool quite a bit with local people for money. And happily, I can report that we would always lose. Not that we planned it that way, but we did. So that way we wouldn't have to accept somebody's money. So again, pool is very, very common and popular in Mongolia. I should also say that these particular photos, I actually don't take photos of people when I travel. Hans actually did take these photos and then he sent them to me later. And when I decided to use them for this particular slideshow, I decided to use them, but to obviously star out people's faces. There is one photo later on that you will see in which there's someone's face is shown, but she's actually a friend of mine, my guide, who I actually just talked to yesterday. So again, there will be a photo that you will see of somebody with their face showing. The Mongolian horse is the only true wild horse in existence. People sometimes think because that there are wild herds of Mustang in the American West, that those are wild horses, but they're not. They're actually feral horses that were once domesticated and have since escaped and become feral. But the Mongolian wild horse is the only true wild horse in existence, which means that it's a horse that's never been ridden by man. And I think too, when you see the shape of its body, you can kind of see that there's something almost prehistoric about it. You could imagine that it's the kind of horse that one would see in cave paintings. Again, it has a slightly different look to it. It's a little bit more stout in certain kinds of ways. So I just wanted to point that out. The grasslands of Mongolia are incredibly beautiful, incredibly remote, and incredibly sparse as far as population is concerned. So these are just some photos to show you the grasslands, and again, various places around the country. And animals. It's also true that, as you learn in the book, when the Soviet Union was in power in the 20th century, but Mongolia in many ways was a puppet state up until around 1992. And at that time, the Soviets actually did much to destroy the Buddhist culture there. And so there are still Mongolias, and now Buddhism is on an uptick now that Mongolia is a democratic country. And so you can see many of these monasteries, those that were not destroyed and that are now again flourishing in a democratic Mongolia. So again, it's just a stupa and another image there. So I will read now the second section in the book. Now there is only the black ball remaining for me to sink, the thing a hole rumbling in space. At the other end of the table, my opponent draws heavily on the cigarette he lights after I sink 3 in a row. He stands smoking with the toothpick still wedged in his teeth, eyeing the 2 balls he has left on the table. The angle of my final shot is not an easy one. Earlier, the second ball I pocket is a spectacular combination shot, the men all gasping as it rolls in. As there is no chalk, I rub the tip of my stick in the dirt. My opponent is breathing hard. It is proving to be an exciting game. Should he lose, there is no reason for him to hang his head. Oddly enough, a loss could be good for business. Once word gets out, normally reticent herdsmen might start to saunter up and lay down their hard-earned tukruk, thinking he is beatable. I wonder if he has a wife and children. I wonder why he chooses a life in town, the town consisting of a few hundred people and a series of dusty buildings constructed in the blocky Russian style, when every beautiful thing is far from here. I clear my mind and lean in, the stick an extension of my body. In the silence, Uvu's two favorite sayings come to me. The world is what we make it, and a man's dreams are the most real part of him. My grandfather with his thick limp, his broken teeth, his eyes forever scanning the horizon. I draw my arm back and send the universe scattering. The cue ball goes spinning erratically off the 8, a comet colliding with an asteroid. Collectively, we watch the white ball roll toward a pocket. Life is suffering. Everywhere mercy and the power of mercy. I exhale and the cue ball falls in. The men cheer. My opponent smiles. Very nice game, he says. Because I am a monk, as a formality, he offers me back my money, but I bow and he stuffs the bill in his pocket. Brother, how do you play so well? Someone asks. I do not tell him the truth, that this is my first game ever. I think of Mun, my brother with his hair braided down to his shoulders in the old style worn by the horsemen of Genghis Khan. If I close my eyes, I can see one of Mun's braids skimming the table as he bends down to survey a shot. Each day at Yatu Gol's morning puja, in my mind's eye, Mun on his golden cushion, silently reminding me we are all Genghis Khan's murderous descendants, every last one of us. I turn toward my questioner. Even under his hat, the work of years in the summer sun is obvious. I imagine the simple life this man leads out on the grasslands, the smell of sheep and the milk hardening on the roof, but nothing is ever simple. Once you are bitten by a snake, you become cautious of rope. I tell the man an approximation of the truth. In another life, I say. Then I walk to the community center and the town's one large tree, and I plant myself beneath it with nothing but a bag of money and a half-written letter wrapped up in the folds of my robe, and wait for my destiny to claim me. Listen closely. Today may be the year 2015, the month July, but in the universe's eternal calendar, it is always now. What every moment of sentience for the past 23 years teaches me. There is one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering. This is the true journey. Everything else is bait. I place myself on the earth with the intention of rising up, rooted like a tree. So that's the second section. And then just to talk a little bit about some of these photos. Again, as I mentioned, the grasslands and the steppe, the Mongolian steppe, are just incredibly gorgeous places. As I also mentioned, so Genghis Khan, again, obviously created the world's largest overland empire in the 12th and 13th centuries. He's a figure that you see all throughout Mongolia, and he's also a figure that I've scattered throughout the book. So you find out a bit about him. It's true that for many of us in the West, when we think of Genghis Khan, we think that he was simply a bloody despot, and I'm sure he was a very violent leader who led to many, many hundreds and thousands of people dying. But at the same time, he's also a more complicated figure. So for example, in the year 2000, Time magazine named him their man of the millennium. And one of the reasons why they did that is because he was the first to implement really kind of sophisticated ways of governing. So for example, he established a postal service. He also established the idea of diplomatic immunity, of allowing ambassadors to move from nation to nation without worrying about being harmed. He also established a version of religious freedoms, et cetera, et cetera. So again, he's a much more complicated figure than many of us in the West perhaps give him credit for being. Lastly, this is one of my favorite pictures of a house, a typical house out on the grasslands. On the roof there, in that wooden box, the white things there, that's actually milk. You can see that. So it's milk that they put in molds and they let harden and they dry it in the sun, and then it's eaten later on as a snack. So it's not cheese. It actually is, again, it's hardened milk, which I think is really interesting. So this is the last section that I'll read. And in this particular section, it's true that my images don't correspond quite so tightly. So there are some images just to show you Mongolia. Like I said, some of them don't necessarily correspond quite so tightly to the story. So the next section. The moon is already rising hours before sundown when my opponent staggers up the road and motions for me to follow. Both pool sticks are gripped in his hands, the toothpick still clenched between his teeth. Prior to this moment, I spend all day sitting in the lotus position under the larch tree, trying to conquer the feeling spreading in my chest, a feeling like being carried away by a swollen river, the water like a series of hands dragging you down into the turbid cold. For the past several hours, my heart alternately beating, the mail truck will come, and then the mail truck will not come. But I think of the Rinpoche back in the monastery at Yatugol, my teacher, a man well into his 90s. How he entrusts me with this task, his digital watch periodically beeping on my wrist. How I am only 15 kilometers from the sleeping volcano, and already I am stuck. Such is the life of the grasslands. There are few paved highways here. With travel, there is never any certainty. Journeys that should only take hours stretch on into days or longer. The grasslands are rife with lands where no car ventures. From Boer-Ert, the mail truck that arrives in town once a week is the only scheduled way out, and today it has yet to arrive. Though the sun is still well above the horizon, already the moon begins its nightly climb. To be defeated before I even begin. Inside me, the watery feeling starts to take root, solidify, ice curdling on the surface of a river, my eyes rimmed like glass on a winter day. I move deeper within myself, occupying as little space as possible. My opponent waits for me to rise. Does he know how important it is that I get to Ulaanbaatar's Gandan Tegchingling Monastery before sundown tomorrow? The Buddha says, when the only hope is a boat and there is no boat, I will be the boat. I watch as my opponent spits the toothpick into the dirt. There is nothing else for me to do but follow. My heart falls silent. Destiny is letting yourself go where you are meant to go, even when your mind says otherwise. So those are the first 3 sections I'm going to read from my novel. And again, just to tell you a little bit more about some of these photos. So the middle person in this photo was my guide, Jojo, who again I just chatted with her yesterday on Zoom. And this is us at one of the lakes in Mongolia. As I mentioned, it's a very vast country and there's not that many paved roads. So this is just an image to show that. Here's an actual picture of my guide. But again, in the background, you can see how, those tire tracks, oftentimes those are like many cars will follow the same tire tracks until they kind of get etched into the ground. And again, but you can see the vastness of the landscape. And again, the same here. This is a monastery in Ulaanbaatar, again, Gandan Tegchingling Monastery. It's the monastery that at the beginning of the book, the main character is trying to get to. And then finally, this is just one of my favorite pictures. So this is us on the edge of the Gobi, or maybe at this point we actually are in the Gobi. And we're not actually having car problems. What's happening here is just because it is so hot. We stopped for a break and the driver, Augie, decided to lift the hood simply to let the engine cool down. But again, it's one of my favorite landscapes. I should also say that when we're driving in these areas, it's the kind of thing that he drives primarily by memory and by looking at the landscape. So at this time, this was in 2007, he's not using GPS. He's not really using maps. So it's just amazing to me how people figure out how and where they're going in the landscape. So those are things about my novel. I actually always I call this Poetic Interlude. I began my career as a poet. I published 4 books of poetry before I began publishing fiction. And so I just always like to share at least one poem in a reading, just to show folks that, I write fiction and I also write poetry. So this is just one poem I'm going to read. This poem is actually from my 4th collection called Loose Strife. And this poem is called Loose Strife. So in this collection, the poems basically have to do with different kinds of violence. Sometimes it's actual physical violence. Sometimes it's environmental violence. Sometimes it's economic violence, what have you. So this particular poem has more to do with emotional violence and the kind of violence that falling in love and that unrequited love can bring out in us. And it's very much a lyric poem. It's very associative. So it's not necessarily telling a linear story. But yes, so this poem is called Loose Strife. I will not say its name, the way it ruined me. The body halved, a kind of mitosis, suddenly everything on the cellular level as if sentient, the potatoes growing eyes in the dark under the sink. The way Lysimachus, for whom the invasive is named, walked and walked through the terrible burning, the emotion openly disfiguring his face. The way a lover will sometimes turn toward the beloved in that other language, the thing shuddering under the skin until it floats up into the light with all the colors of ephemera and bursts. There was a maze. There was a photograph of the night sky taken over several hours, the stars like scratches on a record. As far as I know, there is no unified theory as to why it exists, except the theory of the animal, the theory of glands and secretions. It comes when it comes, and if fortunate, it comes without end. The lesser vertebrates rub themselves in its musk, coat themselves in its glory. It ruined me, and I let it, hands held above my head as if under arrest. All right, so moving on. I'm just going to talk really briefly about my play, which it's premiering streaming tomorrow, but it's actually been running for about not quite a week. And it's showing here in Madison at our Overture Center. And again, if anybody's interested, again, it will start streaming for 10 days starting tomorrow. And so if you had an interest in it, all you have to do is go to forward, as in not backward, but forwardtheater.com, and you can find out more information about streaming it. And again, that's forwardtheater.com. And so just to tell you very briefly about this play, which is called the Midolinian Debate, and you can see the 4 actors featured there. The genesis of the play is that a friend of mine who's a writer many years ago in the year 2000 told a bunch of us who were writers an incredible story about his father. And that basically the story is that this person that I knew who's a writer as well, his father had children in his 20s and then got divorced, got remarried in his 40s and had children, had my friend, this writer, in his 40s, and then got divorced, and then went on to remarry in his 70s and to have another child in his 70s. And so it turned out that the father was having a child in his 70s at the same time that my friend was having his first child, like in his 30s. And I just remember sitting in this room and all these writers were all like, wow, that is such an amazing story that has to become something. So I think this kind of just shows like that was the original inspiration for the story, but it's true that my play has really, there's a little bit of a spark in that, but it's really changed. And so the synopsis of my play is that basically we're in New York City post 9/11 in the weeks and months after that incident, after that atrocity, after that happening. And 2 couples are basically rethinking their life priorities, as many of us were doing after 9/11 and as many of us are doing now, as the pandemic hopefully begins to come to an end. Rethinking, are these the ways that we want to be living? Have we made the right decisions? Is there time for us to readjust? All those sorts of things. And so basically we have an older African-American couple and then a younger interracial couple. And again, it's the idea of these 2 couples sort of reprioritizing their lives. And so, as I mentioned, again, I thought it may be said on this slide, but it doesn't. So again, if you have an interest in seeing this play, forwardtheater.com is the place to go. But that brings me to the end of my slideshow. So I'm actually going to close this, and then I'm going to stop sharing screen. So hopefully I have stopped sharing screen and I am here and hopefully ready to take people's questions.
All right. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we don't have any questions yet from the audience, but that's fine because I have a bunch of my own.
Okay.
And actually, I was kind of like, I was enthralled by your presentation and forgot to pop up this beautiful banner saying that everyone watching should type up questions. So my apologies for getting lost in your presentation.
Zero worries.
So you mentioned that you went to Mongolia in 2007.
Mm-hmm.
Have you been kind of formulating the idea for this book since then?
So I'm very fortunate that I've actually been able to travel very extensively in the world. Again, it's a humble brag, and I know how lucky I am to be able to say this, that I've actually been to all 7 continents. And so when I go someplace, I actually go primarily as a tourist. I don't know what I'm going to do with the landscape or if it's ever going to show up in my work. There's many places I've gone to that I haven't written about. So my very first book, which is set in Vietnam, I had been to Vietnam before I really realized what that book was going to be about. I went to Vietnam the first time, I think in 2001, and then I eventually published a book about Vietnam in 2015, right? And so very similarly with this, I was in Mongolia strictly as a tourist in 2007. And I think it was roughly 2010 that I heard the story that the Dalai Lama at the time was saying that because he fears that the Chinese government will politicize his death after he passes away and will name a new puppet Dalai Lama, that he was saying at the time that he was considering the unprecedented step of reincarnating while he's still alive. And I remember hearing that story and being like, my mind's like, what would that mean? What does that look like? And I went down a real rabbit hole about reincarnations just in general. I should say that the Dalai Lama no longer says that. He has a different protocol in place for once he passes away. But like I said, it was that original sort of story that I heard that sort of planted the seed in my mind. And I began doing some research and thinking about things. And I thought about where would be a good place to set a story about reincarnation. And I realized it would be Mongolia. So many people don't realize, but for example, the word Dalai Lama is actually a combination. So Dalai is actually a Mongolian word, which means ocean or vast, and Lama is the Tibetan word for a spiritual teacher. There's many ways in which there's a lot of cross-cultural just pollination between Mongolia and Tibet. There's many just similarities culturally and also in the ways in which Tibetan Buddhism is practiced. And so I realized that it would be an ideal landscape to set this particular story. So it wasn't the idea that I was thinking about it, all that time. But then once I began to think about reincarnation, like I said, I realized that would be a really great landscape to set a story in.
And to be in a country that's so young politically, but so old historically, and had so rich and very unique. I mean, honestly, your book is the first book of fiction that I have ever read set in Mongolia, and I've read fiction literally around the world. And somehow didn't realize that I was missing Mongolia.
Yeah. There was a Mongolian poet just published, one of the first Mongolian poets to be published in English and translated into English. I can't pronounce the name, but yeah, so there's just all kinds of ways in which there's super rich history, all kinds of things. And yet it's true, like in the West, we just don't know that much about it, right? So it's one of the reasons why in the back of the book, there are various organizations and things like that. And I included links, some organizations that support, again, both Tibetan and Mongolian artists and scholars and things like that. So places where people have an interest, they can go to find out more information. But it is an interesting, because you're right, there's this ancient culture, and then obviously 1992 for many ways it was the time when their democracy was coming into being. And so in thinking about that and people's so for example, one of the interesting things was that before 1992, most people there was no need to really have a last name, to have a family name. And so, but then as it was decided that yes, we need to have family names and those kinds of things, and the eagerness with which people went about deciding like how they would name their families and things. It's in the novel a little bit, and it's an interesting story, and it's interesting to think about that idea of, again, coming from this ancient culture, but then deciding like, okay, what are some things that ways in which the culture might change as we move beyond Soviet times, et cetera, et cetera. So
you skipped ahead in my questions. Because I was actually going to ask, I want to get to Elizabeth's comment, but I was going to ask about the names because I feel like there's a fact or some sort of statement about how Genghis Khan has the most living descendants or something like that. Do you know if that's because of the adoption of names? Because I don't think I knew that fact previously, but then when I read your including that fact.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to names, it's true that his particular clan name was the name that many people decided to adopt as their family names. So that's one of the reasons why, again, Borjin, was his clan name. And so that's a very common now last name, because a lot of people chose to, out of pride, to do that. As far as the idea about his DNA, right? That's another. So the whole question of, like I think it's like specifically it's in men, right? There's some I don't really understand the difference between X, Y, and that kind of thing, but the idea that like 1 in 20 men, on the face of the earth supposedly maybe have genetic material that goes back to to that time period. I have to admit I don't know as much about that particular thing, but yeah, and obviously, he was also the founder of dynasties. So the question of like, is it him or the dynasties? And thinking about his dynasties, his descendants went on to rule places in China, to rule places in India, to rule places in Iran. I mean, it was vast, right? So if you think about like genetic material in that sense, also there's just ways in which, again, his mark on this, even on our world, 800 years later, it's still here. So
yeah. Right, so Elizabeth says, what a change from We Ride Upon Sticks. Absolutely fascinated to read When I'm Gone, Look for Me in the East. A link I'm seeing is about ways of knowing and understanding. Mm-hmm. And I was going to ask a question about that, and then I'll get to Elizabeth's actual question. But I read the New York Times review of the book after I read it.
So I haven't read it, so okay. I'm like, so don't tell me anything it says.
Oh, okay. Well, it's very good.
I've heard. I try not to read my reviews at the time, so I read them months and months and months later when there's not as much sting. Because the truth is, I heard that this review was very good. My last book, I didn't get such a good review in the New York Times, Oh. So again, for me, it is a little bit of a protective thing to like, I read them in my own time when it's not going to sting, or what have you. So, but anyway, so having said that, your question, sorry.
No. So yes, this book is incredibly different from We Ride Upon Sticks. I'm wondering for you as an author, what your through line is that kind of brings you to these stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there definitely are through lines. So one of them is I like in all of my novels to have one magical element. I realize that it's because to me having one magical element allows, I describe it as taking something from 3D into 4D, right? So it's like if I didn't have a magical element, I would be in this world and it would be the way this world is, which is fine. But by having one magical element, it allows you to like transcend this world a little bit. So my very first book, She Weeps Each Time You're Born, which I have to say of all my books is actually my favorite. Set in Vietnam, is very sad, but it follows somebody who was born at the end of the American War in Vietnam. And this person, this Vietnamese woman, has the power to hear the voices of the dead. And so that's the magical element in that book. And thinking about my second book, We Ride Upon Sticks, obviously the magical element is witchcraft and this teen beginning to have a hive mind, et cetera, et cetera. And then in this particular book, we have twin brothers. And again, it's a very similar kind of thing. These twin brothers, because they're twins and because they're born, it's kind of, there's many cultures in which believe that if a child is born with a caul over its face, that it has second sight and can see the future. In my book, these twins are born with a caul over their face and it allows them to share thoughts. So again, so that's one of the through lines is that there is a magical element a bit in each book, right? And then the last through line, and I'm actually working on a new book that's set in Antarctica that I describe as being like an adult version of Lord of the Flies. So basically a group of tourists get stuck in Antarctica. And the whole question is like, are they going to band together and make it? Or are they going to like fight and not make it, right? And in thinking about it, though, so the other through line of these books is that I am interested in underrepresented places. Like, so you had mentioned that you've never read a book or you've never seen Mongolia, in a novel. You do see Vietnam, but oftentimes when we see it historically, although this is changing, we would only see it represented by like former American soldiers or what have you writing about it. And it was always about the American War. And so my book was about Vietnam. So I wanted to show people like at least for the last 100 years, a much fuller history of what Vietnam is. Like Vietnam is so much more than the Vietnam War, right? So that was my goal there. And thinking about We Ride Upon Sticks, I wanted to show a bit about the history of the witch trials and think about this particular place, this landscape, which is the North Shore of Boston, where I'm from. So hopefully as you're reading that book, you're also learning specifics about a place. It's not that it's underrepresented, but it's a place that people maybe just don't really know the history of Salem in certain ways. And so I was interested in getting that across. And then obviously in this book, very much I think of Mongolia as being a character in the book, and just learning things about Genghis Khan and learning things about the history of Mongolia and learning things about Tibetan Buddhism, et cetera, et cetera. So that's definitely a through line. And again, in my next book, I intend to do something similar with Antarctica and thinking about Antarctic explorers. Also the environmental impact on Antarctica right now. So landscape. So like I said, it's magical element and then landscapes. Those are definitely the two things I think tie all these books together.
Fantastic. That does answer Elizabeth's question. Is it set present day or?
It is. So for the next book in Antarctica, yes, it is present day. As of right now.
Have recently discovered that I love cli-fi.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very much looking forward to that.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, now I don't want to ask. The review that you have not read mentioned, and I did not notice this, but also I was not. I'm not an author myself, so I don't pay attention to a lot of craft. I read for enjoyment, and your book created like a very enjoyable reading experience that actually compared to, in a lot of ways, Becky Chambers. A Psalm for the Wild Belt, because it is also another road trip story with a monk. Quite a bit different in a lot of ways. There's a robot in her book. There is a machine, so I guess technically. But it's so kind of peaceful, and it has so much internal conflict, and thankfully for what we are dealing with right now, not a lot of external. So yes, this is a very timely book and very necessary and needed for a lot of readers, I'm certain. The review, though, mentioned that the book is written entirely in present tense. Is that true? And how did you do that?
Yeah. So obviously in the sections that I read tonight, the only time it shifts into future tense is if there's a quote. So there's a quote, for example, in the section that I read, it's a quote from the Buddha. If the only hope is a boat and there is no boat, I will be the boat. And so again, I just decided, like, I'm going to keep those quotes as is. I'm not going to play with their verb tense. And so the entire book is written in present tense. And the reason why I wanted to do that, again, not just Buddhism, but many world religions stress the importance of the here and now, right? Stress the importance of living in the moment, all those kinds of things. We're all trying to be mindful these days. It's this whole idea, be present. People get that as a tattoo and all that kind of fun stuff. And so it made sense to me that the entire book would be written in present tense. And yet, having said that, it's also true that it's not a book that's chronological. So for example, we have chapters where we get like the history of these twins and we see them growing up. And so it does move back and forth in time, right? And so the question became like how to write an entire book in present tense that still has like kind of flashbacks, or what have you. And that was one of the reasons why I chose to write the book in such short sections, was because I knew that would at least would help make it a little bit easier on the reader. The fact that I was playing with time in certain kinds of ways. I think if the chapters had been longer, it might have been a little bit more difficult to make some of those transitions. Like, wait, it's all present tense, but we're supposed to be back here now, or what have you. But yes, that was definitely something that I gave myself. And when I was originally conceiving of the book, I did think of it as a kind of challenge. I sometimes like to give myself a challenge. Sometimes I feel like I had like built-in people do this oftentimes in poetry. In poetry, we talk about constraints. So for example, if you're writing a sonnet, you have rules. It's got to be this many lines. You got to have rhyme scheme. You got to have meter. What have you. And so I sometimes like to give myself rules or things to, again, constraints in fiction. I wish I could remember what my constraints were. Oh, my constraint in my last book, my constraint was, although it's not super hard, but was the first person plural voice. So I knew, I'm like, okay, that's going to be like the rule that I have to follow, is the story is written in first person plural. Thinking back to 2015, what the constraint was with my first novel, I might not have had a hard and fast one there, just because, again, it was my first novel and I was trying to figure out how to write a novel. So I guess I can't say that I always have a constraint, but so this book, though, the constraint very much was I have to keep it in present tense, which it was a bit of a challenge. So.
Well, I think you did it masterfully, because I did not even, my reading experience was just completely driven and not distracted. So for me not to even have registered that, even with I was like, there Her flashbacks. How can it all be written in present tense?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, congratulations. That's wow. Like, I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship between twins.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you had close twin relationships to look at, and how you were able to write that. The relationship between twins is incredibly unique, and it varies between cultures, obviously, which you did a very good job with. So I'm wondering how you were able to do that and what challenges you found with it.
Mm-hmm. I think, I didn't have any, I mean, I'm sure many of us know twins, just like you went to school with twins, and many of the twins that are born now are fraternal twins. But, the identical twins that people know, there's always, oh yeah, because they're identical twins, which is just that much more rare and that much more special, right? But I think, at least for me, and thinking about the identical twins that I have known through time, it's the idea of, it's not a struggle, or a challenge is probably too strong a word, but the idea of like, that they are themselves, like each one, they are individuals, you know what I mean? And that oftentimes the world wants to see them as one, but no, that they have individual quirks, they got individual, what have you, and all those kinds of things. And so it just made sense to me to lean into that and thinking about this book. So we have twins, they're identical twins, but leaning into the fact that they are different, that they are each their own person, right? And then I think the other thing that I was interested in leaning into in a book about spirituality is the idea of spectrums, right? And kind of in some ways binary-isms, right? So like someone who's religious and spiritual and someone who's not. And we see that within the twins. Like that's how they sort of start off, that one of them is the monk and that the other one has renounced his vows. And so it's the idea that they seem like opposites, right? And then hopefully by the end of the book, maybe, you learn various things and maybe they're in different places. But I wanted to purposefully play with that, this idea that they're twins and in every kind of way visible that you would think that they're similar and yet they're not. And then hopefully by the ending though, but maybe they are closer than we thought, right? So I had a lot of fun thinking about that and working with them and just thinking through the kinds of possibilities that they could bring to the page for me. So
I feel like maybe a disproportionate amount of twins in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I have several family members that are twins. No one in my immediate family, but two of my best friends growing up, and then my best friend in high school. Mm-hmm. Fraternal in that situation, but identical in most of the others. So mm-hmm. It was very interesting to read it being done so well and convincingly. So
thanks.
One of the other things that I think struck me most in fact-wise in the reading was the pollution. And I'm wondering, were you there during just the summer or summer and winter to experience the beautiful open sky and then the pollution?
I have not been to Mongolia in the winter, so I've only been there in the summer. And it's funny because I was talking to, again, JoJo, who is now, it's funny, when she was my guide, she was a young college student who had dreams of travel, and all these things, and talking to her, and she's achieved all her dreams. Like, she's been to the United States twice. She lived in Australia for 2 years. She's been to India. She's been all over, and I'm so happy for her. And she actually is working for an environmental company now in Mongolia. It's also true that there's a little bit in the book, you do find out about mining. Mining has become, it's a major resource for them, and you can't blame, there's so much natural beauty there. And yet there's also, when it comes to natural resources, there's a lot of wealth as well. And so you do have mining companies who are there, who are doing various things that, that mining companies do. And so JoJo, my guide, was telling me yesterday that so we actually zoomed, and she was in her car, like she was parked by one of these areas that I remember in the city that gets touched on just a little bit towards the beginning of the book. It's kind of what's called like the Ger district. So again, in the West, sometimes we have called those houses, those circular houses, sometimes people call them yurts, but in Mongolian, they'll call them gers, G-E-R, right? And so there's actually in Ulaanbaatar, there is a district where instead of like buildings, there's actually gers, right? And so it's true that, it was mentioned in the book that in the summer, the the skies are amazing and beautiful, but then in the winter, unfortunately, because a lot of people heat their homes with coal or, things like that, that in wintertime, the pollution can get to be quite serious. And Jojo was telling me yesterday that the project that she's working on now is to hopefully convert a lot of these gers into actual buildings, and so that way that they can be heated more cleanly and not using like coal and things like that. And she did say, she actually told me that last year, I don't know why she had said it was true, but I guess they did ban that you can't burn raw coal anymore. And so she said that actually last winter, the pollution was much, much better. It was great. But that this year, for some reason, she wasn't quite sure what happened, but this year it was maybe back to what it had been. But they're aware of it, and and they're working on it as a culture to have those amazing skies that you see in the summer. And again, it's also different in the cities. When you're out in the grasslands, that is true. Like the air quality is just amazing because it is such a vast country. It's really in the cities where you get the issues with pollution and that kind of stuff.
So you have been all over the world, which I have. I've only done that through reading. So I'm wondering, culturally, what was the most unique thing when you were in Mongolia that just makes you automatically think like this is this is what makes Mongolia special?
As I was mentioning it in the little facts about Mongolia. So the idea of the culture of hospitality. So when you're out on the grasslands, that was basically how we spent most of our nights. It would be me and Hans and Miriam, this Dutch couple, and then our driver, and then Jojo. And we would literally just look for a ger. We would drive up to them, you'd knock on the door, you'd ask to stay for the night. And I should say that for foreigners, I do believe that, for example, that Jojo would pay whatever family or whoever took us in. I think that they would pay something for us to stay there as foreigners, but that for Mongolians, it's like, oh yes, you need a place to stay, come on in. And it wasn't just the idea that people, would open their doors to you, you would come in, but it was so much fun. Because for a lot of these people are, because the steppe is so broad that you might be like, they're visitors, they haven't had visitors in a long time. And so it would be the idea of really just spending time with people, around a fire, literally just singing, I had this one. So in the slide, for example, that was the slide at the lake. It's like one of the funnest nights, we were camped at the lake, and there were other people who were camped at the lake. And there was one guy who was camped there who was he was actually a member of parliament, and they invited us over to the camp, and they made us food, and we sat around this fire, and we just sang and just for hours, just sitting around a fire singing with people. You know what I mean? Yes, so it's that sense of hospitality, of welcoming people. Things have changed, like now Jojo was telling me, most people have phones. I mean, I don't really know how reception is in some of the more remote areas. I would hope that, when people are sitting around the fire, they can't also be texting, but again, that's progress, right? You can't hold that. That's what we do in the West, and there's no reason why people in other places shouldn't also have access to technologies and all those kinds of things too, right? But yeah, so that's in thinking about my memories of Mongolia, like some of my funnest nights ever in my life, just sitting around fires in the summer and just sitting with people. So
that's lovely. We are getting closer to the end, so audience watching, if you do have questions that have not already, even if they have already been answered, maybe if you came in a little bit late and have a burning question, be sure to type that up in the comments, because I think I have one more question for you. So clearly your writing is very different, but has through lines. What about you as a reader?
Interestingly, I was talking about this the other night. I, for the most part, do not reread novels. Some people, they have favorite books and they reread them, that kind of thing. I rarely reread novels. I'm also a poet, so I read quite a bit of poetry, and I do reread poetry. I have to admit, as of right now, I do not read a lot of creative nonfiction or memoir. I just don't. I do read a lot. I'm reading more and more plays because, again, obviously I'm working more as a playwright, so I'm reading more plays. The play that I read over and over and over again, because I think it's a perfect play, is an old play from the 1970s, and that's Equus I love Equus. I think Equus is like a perfect place. I reread that quite often. But as far as the kinds of things that I read, I mostly read quote unquote literary fiction, right? I'm glad that literary fiction is expanding to include things that maybe seem a little genre-ish, So for example, like Ling Ma's Severance, you know what I mean? Like, okay, it's kind of like zombies in there, maybe a bit, So I like the idea that, again, it's expanding and it's not just that there can be, like I said, elements of genre now in literary fiction. But I read mostly. So I'm trying to think, like, I've been reading right now books that I have, 'cause I have so many books everywhere, Lauren Groff's Matrix. I just started reading, and it's 2 or 3 years old, but Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which I'm really super loving. I have the new like Karl Ove Knausgaard book. I have like Patricia Lockwood, is that her name? I have her newest book. I have the new book out by Sheila Heti. So that's the kind of stuff that I love to read. I have just, I have Colson Whitehead's. I think it's a horror book. I think it's called The Other Black Girl, which I'm really looking forward to reading. So for me, it is, as of right now, I read mostly just novels. Novels and The New Yorker. So those are, but yeah.
Yeah. I'm very much the same, except I do read quite a bit of genre fiction because it has been very calming during the pandemic. I kind of fell in love with some sci-fi that I had never really fallen in love with before, and have been exploring that side of me during the pandemic. But I always have a place in my heart for romance and for mysteries. So
no, because I did during the pandemic. I read a lot of what's his name? The guy, like, is it Dashiell Hammett or like Raymond Chandler, or like a lot of those kind of like detective noir. So sometimes I do go down like, so for example, science fiction wise, is her name, is it, it's the initials, the African-American author, like, is it N.K. Jemisin?
Mm-hmm.
Like her short stories, I think, are just so original. They're so original. So I can also go down those kind of rabbit holes too. At times. So, but yeah, I hear what you're saying. Like, yeah. And like I said, genre now, it's almost becoming less meaningful because people are just trying all different kinds of things, which is really exciting. So
blending of genre and like multi-genre, like murder mystery set in space. Like, yeah. Where do you put that?
Yeah.
Anywhere, because like that's a book for anyone. Like, yeah. One last question from Elizabeth that will round us out.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth.
So Elizabeth asks, when did you realize you were a writer?
I feel like I actually came to this later than other writers, but maybe that's not true. And the reason I say that is because, you always hear those stories about people like where I grew up, John Updike used to live in the area, and as a kid, like not as a kid, but as a teenager, be like, oh, John Updike. Like every once in a while you would see him in a bookstore. You'd be like, it's John Updike, And at the time I seem to recall that there was this anthology, and in the anthology it was like the first published pieces or the first extant writing of all these really super famous authors that they had somehow like given like their first stories that they had written when they were young, right? There was a story in there by Stephen King that he wrote when he was like a teenager, and I remember like it was amazing, and still it was about a mirror that if certain people looked in the mirror and they saw death behind them, they would end up disappearing. I think he wrote it like he was a teenager, and I was like, oh my gosh. And John Updike, similarly, like there was a little thing that he had in there, just beautifully written. I think it was about penmanship, and I would hear stories. So, for example, Joyce Carol Oates, who you always hear the story that she got like a typewriter when she was like, I don't know, 6, and she was already writing her first novels, And so I would hear those stories about people who were doing this when they were fairly young, and I'd be like, that wasn't me. I mean, I did write things for fun. I did I would draw, write things, I played, whatever, but I didn't think of myself as a writer. And when I went to college, I was not an English major, so I still didn't think of myself as a writer. And then, I worked in a bookstore for a year, and then somehow I ended up going to an MFA program. And I think that's when I began to be like, oh, okay. So I was in an MFA program, and then I got various fellowships for writers. And then it began to be like, oh, yeah, maybe. And then I ended up coming to Wisconsin, where I am now, on a fellowship. And ultimately, I was asked if I wanted to join the faculty. And then I would say yes. By then I realized it, but I don't think I realized it until I went to graduate school. So, which to me is maybe a little bit later than, like I said, other people knowing when they're teenagers. But I think it's a positive thing. I don't think I think you can decide. I have a colleague who didn't get her MFA until she was in her 40s. So I think it's like, I think at any age, if people decide that this is something they want to do, then I say, hey, go for it and take out a piece of paper and see what you create.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening, for writing such an incredible book. Again, this is my advanced reader copy, but I put a link in the chat as a reminder. I also put the theater link in there a little bit earlier as well. So, but really, just such a pleasure meeting you. I love Madison, so I hope to get up there to explore again soon and maybe run into you at a bookstore or on campus. But yes, thank you so much for everything you do.
Thanks.
And to the audience watching, I hope you have a great rest of your evening, and we will see you again really soon.